My name is Dr. Mary Priest, and I'm the Provost and Vice President Academic at Sheridan, and I welcome you here. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to Creating the Future Today, Day 2, the Canadian Symposium on Undergraduate Research and Creative Activities. Today, our conversation will shift to providing our students with practical undergraduate research opportunities. That is, solid problem-solving experiences with industry and community partners during their studies that will help them become resilient drivers of Canadian innovation when they enter the workforce. Before we start today, there's a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to just share with you. First of all, as is evident at the moment, the Sheridan Production House staff will be actively involved in taking photos and videos today to document the progress of our conversations today as they did yesterday. It's our intent at the conclusion of the conference to post these photos and videos on our website for the conference. During the day, you may in fact be asked to participate in an interview, which is entirely your choice, but a short interview that would be part of the documentation of the conference would be wonderful if you chose to share your feelings about what was going on or what is going on. The website is creatingthefuture.ca, and you should feel free to stay connected to that site because we hope this is the beginning of other things. For those of you who are active on Twitter, we encourage you to continue to use our conference hashtag, which is hashtag lowercase future, uppercase PSE. If you've not already had a chance, please take time to check out the student applied research projects. There are several here in the room, but just to the left, right, sort of right over there, there are two rooms with a whole series of student research projects that you might find very interesting, and they're just sort of a taste of the kinds of activities that our students are engaged in. And many of you who are here have brought some of the posters and materials with you, which is terrific. The washrooms, again, if you go out this door, left, right, washrooms are down that corridor. The charging station for electronic devices is down on the left of me, and to the right of me. Today the water is over at a watering table as opposed to in the middle of your poster paper and the tables. So if you need water, want water, please feel free to help yourselves. It's now my pleasure to introduce Janice Francisco, who's the principal consultant at Bridgepoint Effect, who will lead today's session following our keynote address. Janice is an organizational development and innovation consultant who operates at the intersections of learning, change, creativity, and innovation to improve organizational performance. She has more than 20 years of experience in the private, nonprofit, and government sectors. Janice is generously giving her time today to help us apply the creative problem-solving tools to this particular challenge through a dynamic World Cafe format. Please join me in welcoming Janice.
I'm going to give this another try. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi. It's nice to be with you here today. I wanted to go over a few things with regards to what we'll be doing in the World Cafe. Can I just see a show of hands? Who has actually participated in a World Cafe event before? Great. We have some experts in the room. We will be using a format today, slightly different than yesterday, where you will get to have a table host. So it will be somebody at your table rather than one of the facilitators that were circulating yesterday that was working with you. So if you are the kind of person who would like to organize and support some dialogue at your table today, we'd be very grateful if you would make that offer to your table to play that role. I promise that we will give you all the information you need so that you can do that well. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. What I do want to talk about first is the question that we're going to be focusing on today. So we'll be drawing on some of the skills that you learned yesterday about creative problem solving. And the focus question for today is, in what ways might we integrate applied research and creative activities in our curriculum so that our institutions become leading injectors of creative thinkers and innovators into the Canadian economy? And given what we're going to hear from Todd Hirsch this morning, I think that's a great place for us to be starting, and I think he'll give you some of the fuel and some of the ideas you'll need to be able to participate in those conversations. Basically, in the World Cafe format today, you will be working in focusing on 3 different mini questions that we're going to give you. And as each question is being posed, you're going to be working at a different table. So you'll start off likely at the table that you are right now, but as we move to question 2 and question 3, we're going to be asking you to move to a different table. This gives you an opportunity to meet some new friends, to connect with some people that you haven't seen for a while, and also to get a variety or a diversity of opinion as well as ideas and insights into the different places that we'll be seeing. If you've seen the agenda, we actually are hearing from a student, an industry partner, and one of the profs who's been involved in working on creating that experience for students and integrating these sorts of activities into their work. So that's all I'm going to tell you for now. It will be something that will get you moving and talking. It's a very divergent exercise today, so we'll be remembering some of those rules on divergent thinking that Gerard had taught you yesterday, and I hope you will be enjoying the day and giving us your full participation as we go through it. At this point, I would like to set the stage, or to invite Darren Lawless, Dr. Darren Lawless, up as the Dean of Undergraduate Research at Sheridan, and he's going to set the stage for some more of the things that we'll be doing today.
So first, thank you very much for agreeing to participate. This is a unique conference in that we don't get information from you as well. And thank you, Janice, for agreeing to facilitate it. I'd also like to thank very much OISE for being a co-sponsor of this conference. We value your contribution and all the input that you put in here. My name is Darren Lawless. I haven't changed the name since I've come up to the stage. And it is my pleasure to be your Master of Ceremonies. Today is an exciting day. We will be looking at innovation and what it means and why do we do research. Innovation is a cornerstone of our discussion. We'll examine how to best help our students to grow into leading innovative thinkers through real world problem solving with community partners during their studies. As Dr. Priest mentioned, we have a sampling of student and applied research projects. I would encourage, plead, beg, ask you to go take a look at the incredible work that our students, and in many cases, it's eye-opening to see what our students are capable of doing and how they take the knowledge that we provide them in our institution or institutions such as Sheridan and solve real-life problem, which is going to be helping our economy grow. So to set the stage for this discussion, it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Todd Hirsch. Todd Hirsch received a BA Honors in Economics from the University of Alberta and an MA in Economics from the University of Calgary. Since 1993, he has held a series of economist positions at the Canada West Foundation, the Canadian Pacific Railway, and the Bank of Canada. He joined ATB Financial in May 2007 as the chief economist. He is a regular business columnist for the Globe and Mail and provides economic commentary for the CBC, CTV, and other news media outlets. In 2011, he was recognized as one of Alberta's most influential people by Alberta Venture magazine. He was recently honored by the federal government with the Diamond Jubilee Medal, and in 2014, he was appointed to the Alberta Economic Development Authority. Please join me in welcoming Todd.
Well, thank you, Darren, for that very kind introduction, and thank you so much to the conference organizers for inviting me out here. I know for quite a long time, in fact, Some of the people at Sheridan and I, we've been trying to connect and find a time to talk about some of these things, and schedules didn't work out, but I was very happy when, in fact, this event came up as an opportunity, and I'm thrilled to be out here in Toronto the last couple of days. Yesterday was a fantastic day for me. Not very often, in fact, do I get to just attend a conference and for a full day do nothing but sit and participate and listen and soak it all in. And most of the time I'm stuck in economic conferences, which are, I got to tell you, nowhere near as fun as these ones. They could take a few lessons in creativity. So it was great to be here yesterday with my group, meeting new friends, meeting new people, reconnecting with some familiar faces and some familiar names. The title of my presentation this morning is drawn from the book that I wrote with my co-author, by the way, Robert Roach. So sometimes when I refer to we, I'm not, I do have a co-author on it. I'm not split personality or anything like that. The Boiling Frog Dilemma, Saving Canada from Economic Decline. Now, I am going to be approaching the topic of creativity and innovation from an economist point of view. And I actually hope that sort of enriches the conversation this morning, because I know for educators and for people in post-secondary, creativity and innovation maybe means some different things. I am going to be bringing an economic perspective on it. So in other words, why would an economist care about creativity? So that sort of is the genesis behind the book. The title, by the way, the boiling frog, the metaphor, probably a lot of you know the research that they've done on frogs. Apparently, if you put, I was not about to test this theory, but apparently if you put a frog in a pot of cool water, the frog is comfortable. And if you gradually turn up the heat on that pot, the frog, in its complacency or its ignorance, doesn't know to jump out of the pot, and it meets a terrible fate and is boiled to death. Now, I actually happened to do a little bit of research on the research to see, did this really happen? Was this true? Well, it turns out that the original, some of you might know this, the original research was done on lobotomized frogs. It turns out frogs really aren't quite that dumb. They do need a brain, but the original research was to test if a frog's nervous system, the body's nervous system alone, would be enough to propel the frog out of the water. Well, it turns out it's not. But a frog with his brain intact, when he's hot, he's out of the water. They're not really quite that stupid. But we liked the metaphor. We kept the title The Boiling Frog anyway, because we loved the metaphor to describe Canada in the 21st century. Most of all, with the boiling frog, the frog in the story, brain or no brain, hasn't done anything wrong. It just finds itself a victim of circumstance. Canada, I would dare say, in 2014, we're a country that has done almost everything right. I mean, there are improvements we can make. But you don't get to be a country like Canada in 150 years by messing it up all the time, you know? And I think everyone would agree we've got a very desirable place to live here in this part of the Northern Hemisphere. We've done almost everything right. There are things we could be doing better, but like the frog in the pot of water, it's not, we're just a victim of circumstance. We are finding ourselves in a global economy that is changing on us very rapidly. And also, like the frog in the pot of water, we need to take some action. Now, the book itself, I'm going to be drawing some themes from the book, but the book itself is really a call to action by Canadian citizens, not governments. We feel there's a lot of books, a lot of reports saying, here's what government needs to do. Now, don't get me wrong, governments can do a lot of very, very good things, especially around education, especially around maybe infrastructure, transportation, healthcare. But when it comes to making us a creative group of people, I actually don't think the government is particularly well situated or well equipped to make us creative. I think that's the hard work and the heavy lifting we as Canadians have to decide to do. Are we going to be creative individuals or aren't we? A tax credit isn't going to make us creative. So the book is really targeted at trying to inspire Canadians. It's not a policy book, which already makes it a little bit different, because usually when an economist writes a book, it's all around policy prescriptions for governments. This is maybe a prescription for how Canadians, maybe there's some attitudes we need to change or some bad habits we need to change around creativity and entrepreneurship. When we talk about what creates wealth in the economy, it all comes down to this piece of real estate here, the brain. Now, in classic economics, if any of you have ever studied economics, the classical textbooks from the 50s that identify land, labor, and capital, those are the three factors of production, as we call them in economics. Every economic endeavor, anything that creates wealth, needs some combination of land, labor, and capital. Now, we add to this, of course, a fourth factor of production, and that is, sometimes we call it creativity, sometimes we call it entrepreneurialism. The good news around all this, though, for an economist is that those three factors, land, labor, and capital, they're all, in the language of an economist, those are all fixed in the short term. There's not really much you can do to increase those. Longer term, you can do some things, but fortunately, that fourth factor of production is unlimited. And that's really, really good news for economists because that shows, in fact, that our ability to continue to create wealth, to continue to create a prosperous economy, is, in that sense, unlimited. And by the way, when I talk about wealth, I'm not just talking about money or the GDP. The GDP is this hateful statistic that economists like to track. It's really just the value of all the goods and services we produce. It really doesn't have much to say directly about our quality of life or our prosperity. It's just a measure of how much stuff we're producing. When I'm talking about wealth, I am talking about prosperity and a great quality of life that we enjoy. So land, labor, and capital, we add to that fourth factor of production, which is unlimited. Now, when I was putting this presentation together last night, I was trying to draw from as many of the themes that I was hearing in the room, because there are a lot of themes in the book, but I was trying to sort of filter out, draw out those things from the conversations yesterday that were perhaps most relevant in what we're talking about in these 2 days, and hopefully most relevant to, for you folks in post-secondary. The first theme I want to talk about, creativity. Now, there's been a lot of talk already about creativity, and it is a big topic. In some ways, it's kind of an overused word, but I think it's such a rich idea, creativity. Where does creativity come from? You know, what drives creativity? The story I'm going to tell here, I'm borrowing this from Sir Ken Robinson, an author and speaker I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. But he talks about the camera and the early commercialization of photography around the 1860s, 1870s. The camera, of course, predates that by a long measure, but it started to become a little bit more commercially available and a little bit more common around the 1860s. And apparently at the time in London, England, at the Royal Academy of Art, there was a raging debate about this camera innovation. And they were split. The faculty was split in their opinions on this camera. Half of the faculty said, this is bad news for painters. We are doomed. There is no way we are going to have a livelihood ahead of us with this camera. We're going to be wiped out as artists. Their reasoning kind of stemmed from this. If you look at a predominant style of painting in the mid-1800s, realism. Now, a talented or a skilled painter would be able to command quite a good living painting portraits for the upper classes, the royal classes, the nobility. I don't know how much this would cost in today's dollars. Probably someone's figured it out. My guess is this would be in the tens of thousands of dollars today to have a painter come in and paint a portrait of your child or of yourself. And you think of what a camera can do at the snap of a shutter and a fraction of the cost and time. Well, there might have been some reason, in fact, why some of those realist painters, those portrait painters, thought we're in trouble. This camera is going to doom us. But there was another group of thinking at the Royal Academy of Art among the faculty, and they said, no, we don't need to worry about this camera at all. Their reasoning was this camera is a fad. People will play around with it for a little bit, but they're not really going to, catch on with it because, in fact, they argued, cameras and photography has no intrinsic artistic merit to it at all. They said it'll be the Rubik's Cube of its day. People will get tired of it because there's not really too much you can do with a camera. So it'll go away, and we as painters don't need to worry about this. Well, with 150 years on our side, we look back at both of those attitudes and those reasonings as kind of silly, because we know that, in fact, painting did not go away, and in the 20th century, took on whole different styles and expressions. Expressions that those realist painters in the mid-1800s would not have really thought possible. Now, in some ways, I consider that you could think of the camera in photography as liberating a creative spirit in painters. Now, there were a lot of things. A good art historian, any art historians in the room, a good art historian would point out pretty quickly, there were a lot of things going on at the turn of the 20th century. A lot of social things, a lot of political things, that in fact led art and the world of painting in these directions. It wasn't all to do with the camera liberating those realist styles. There were a lot of things going on, but still I can't help but think that photography had a small part to play in kind of moving the world of painting and moving the world of art in kind of new, unexpected directions. And at the same time, photography did not go away in the 20th century. In fact, it too took on whole new different forms and styles with different techniques and practice and different ways of using the camera. Cameras in photography became every bit as much an artistic expression as painting. So the good news in all of that is that creativity, both in the sense of painters and in the sense of photography, creativity is unlimited. I love this quote here. Everyone is born creative. Everyone is given a box of crayons in kindergarten. Then when you hit puberty, they take the crayons away, replace them with books on algebra, maybe economics. Being suddenly hit years later with the creative bug is just a wee voice telling you, I'd like my crayons back, please. Hugh MacLeod, he wrote a great book called Ignore Everybody and 39 Other Keys to Creativity. Probably a lot of you in the room might know about this book. But I just love the spirit of this because it speaks to, I think, the idea that, and we heard this yesterday from Gerard, every one of us has a capacity to be creative. There isn't a creative class. The creative class of artists and theater majors, they don't have sort of what's the word? They don't have a, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, monopoly. They're an economics word. They have no monopoly. Maybe that's why I dropped it out of my head. They have no monopoly on creativity. Creativity is something that every one of us possesses, and it can be developed and it can be exercised. Regardless of the type of work we're in, if we're an economist, a stay-at-home caregiver, a medical professional, someone working in post-secondary, every one of us has the capacity to bring a spirit of creativity with us to our everyday tasks. And again, for an economist, that is really important because that is where you are going to start to see things that in fact do add value and do add wealth and prosperity to our economy. Another theme I love talking about is the OE, the overseas experience. And this was a theme that I did note came up in some of the groups when I was shopping around for ideas, and it did come up in our group. The idea that students could maybe go and travel and live abroad and spend some of their time studying in a different country. Now, a little story I had, this picture here is from Edinburgh, Scotland. I was interviewing a young economist about 5 or 6 years ago already. He was one of a short list of candidates that I was looking at, and he had good education background. He had an undergrad in economics from the University of Saskatchewan. He had gone on to do a master's degree at Queen's University, bright kid. He had a little bit of job work experience mixed in there, but on paper, his resume was more or less on par with the others that were shortlist candidates. But when I was interviewing him, it was strange because he had that proverbial hole in the resume. There was a year listed with nothing kind of attached to it. There was just a kind of nothing there. So I said, well, what did you do in this year between your undergraduate and your graduate work? And I got the feeling he didn't really want to tell me, but he said, well, you know, I had finished my BA and I wasn't quite sure yet what I wanted to do. So I moved to Scotland and I worked in a pub for 9 months. And I said, that is fantastic life experience. I said, you have suddenly become a much more interesting candidate to me, ironically, because it's something not even on your resume. You know, what this tells me is that you are the type of person who's willing to pick himself up, move to barely an English-speaking country. You know, he can move from very different place. I mean, he could have stayed in Saskatoon. There are pubs in Saskatoon. I have firsthand experience with that. He could have, and that is a typical kind of route for a lot of young people to do. Not sure yet what they want to do, so, you know, you might take a job. He could have stayed in Saskatoon and worked in a pub, but he moved to Edinburgh. And I said, I'm not so concerned about your experience pouring beer. I think that's why he didn't put it on there, because I think he thought the work experience wasn't relevant to an economics position. But I said, what this tells me about you is that you've seen the world through different lenses, in fact. You've seen how different cultures operate. You've seen, you've had to adjust to totally different cultures. And that, in fact, will make you a more creative, a more imaginative person. Gregory Burns, he's a neuroscientist. Again, some of you might know of this because you're probably a little bit more connected with this kind of literature. The surest way to spark imagination is to confront the perceptual system with people, places, and things it hasn't seen before. Now that's a very academic, wonky kind of way of saying that something that I think is pretty straightforward. If you want to be a creative person, you've got to get out of Dodge. You've got to see the world through different lenses. I don't know if anyone would really disagree with that kind of premise. The overseas experience is something that is not yet part of our DNA in Canada. Now, a lot of you in the room, maybe you have lived abroad. You guys might not be a perfect sample size for this, or you would probably know of young people who have lived abroad. Most of us have really just traveled abroad, which is a good experience, but I would argue it's not the same experience as living abroad. And I speak in full disclosure here, I'm a bit fraudulent because I have not yet had my opportunity to live abroad. I've traveled abroad, but living abroad, an overseas experience where you're actually living between 6 months and 2 years, we sort of recommend. We would love to see this become part of Canada's DNA. My parents love them to death, but when I was graduating from university, they would have done everything in their power to prevent me from moving to Edinburgh. They would have seen this as reckless. Why on earth would you want to do this? There's good jobs here in Alberta, there's universities, just stay here. This makes so much more sense. You know, this very pragmatic idea of, just there's nothing in Edinburgh for you or anywhere in the world. I think that attitude has changed, but I think it needs to change even more. Other countries, other cultures in the world, notably Australia and New Zealand, that's where I borrowed that term, the OE, from. Is Lisa still here in the room? I was going to ask her if that's, I know a lot of Australians, they use that term, the OE. When are you going on your OE? I would do a better Australian accent if I could. But I would love to see this become a little bit more part of the cultural DNA in Canada, that as educators, that as parents, in fact, we nudge our young people. Don't go and just backpack around Europe. Go actually live somewhere for a year or two. Please come back, and this is one thing a lot of parents, when I give this presentation, I talk about the OE, they come up to me kind of sadly at the end and say, if we encourage them to go live somewhere else, they're not going to want to come home. To which I say, Canada is not a country a lot of people are fleeing from. We might want to flee temporarily in January, but in fact, a lot more people are trying to come to Canada than flee Canada. I said, I'm pretty sure they will come back, and best case scenario, they'll come back with somebody. Because we know Canada has been blessed enormously with the immigrant experience, our economy and our culture. So for a Canadian to go and live abroad, see the world through different lenses, come back with somebody, that's sort of a double blessing for the Canadian economy. And those are the kinds of workers that, in fact, we're going to be needing to attract. Okay, another theme, moving up the value-added chain. Now, this is where I'm putting on my Economist hat a little bit more. These ladies here are engaged in an activity called picking oakum. This picture is also probably from about the 1860s or so. They don't look like they're having a lot of fun. I don't know, it doesn't look like very engaging work, but these ladies are engaged in picking oakum, maybe what we could call the original value-added proposition. What they were doing is collecting little bits of rope off the docks that have been cut off and left there, useless bits of rope, unraveling them manually by hand and collecting the jute fibers, which they collect in those piles, and they can be reused for stuffing or mattresses or bedding or other applications. So they were taking something of low value and adding value to it by doing something manually to it. In Canada, and maybe especially in Western Canada, there's a lot of kind of worry about value added. We don't like this idea of just exporting all our natural resources. We want to apply some value to them. We want to, in the West, for example, we want to do more refining and upgrading and processing of our petroleum resources. For the forestry sector, we want to be building furniture and using, we don't like this idea of just shipping the logs or shipping the lumber abroad. So this idea of value added is moving from here in the value added chain up to here, which is secondary manufacturing. Now, Rob and I say all of that is fine. We're certainly not against value added, and we're certainly not against secondary manufacturing. But we do add a big caveat, and here's what I mean by this. Consider the toilet brush. Unloved, underappreciated. No one really gives too much thought about a toilet brush. This toilet brush here would probably contain 30 cents worth of plastic and metal. This brush here would no doubt be manufactured in China or maybe some other low labor cost country in Asia, shipped back to Canada, and you would go down to Superstore or Target, maybe buy this toilet brush for $8.99. So clearly, in that manufacturing process, there is clear value added, from 30 cents to $9. However, consider these toilet brushes. This is the Elise toilet brush, designed by French designer Philippe Starck. Also 30 cents worth of plastic and metal, also manufactured in China. But you would go down and buy this toilet brush for $39.95. Now here's where for some reason, a lot of the men in the room kind of roll their eyes and say, who on earth would spend $40 on a toilet brush? Actually, a lot of the men would say, what on earth is a toilet brush? These economists, I just can't understand their talk. They're so confusing. But I would say, in fact, that there is value in that toilet brush. Now, it might not be everybody's thing. That might not be your jam. But what the toilet brush on the right possesses that the one on the left it doesn't is an aesthetic property. It's got a design property to it that a lot of people find very appealing, a lot of people find very attractive. There is a value in that. Now, I'm not suggesting Canada is going to become a powerhouse in toilet brush design, but the idea is where Canada needs to place itself on that value-added chain isn't here at the bottom. It may not be here in the secondary manufacturing and upgrading, but it needs to be at the very top, and that is the design stage. If it makes more sense for someone else to assemble the toilet brush, that's what's going to happen anyway. But there's so much value added at that top end, the design piece of it, the engineering stage of things. And Canada, as a highly educated country, this is where we need to be applying creativity to that education so that we can position ourselves at that top end of the design chain. The design, the artists, the engineers, the technologists, all of those things that in fact add tremendous amounts of value to everyday products. Another theme, embracing failure. This came up too in some of the groups that I saw, allowing people to fail and learn from that. In Canada, I don't know if, in our business culture, I don't know if there is much patience with failed attempts. I think perhaps we've got a lot to learn about the process of failure, not wallowing in failure, and certainly that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about mediocrity, but I am talking about accepting failed attempts, learning from it, telling as many people what you've learned from that, and then moving on to something more successful. Some of you in the room look old enough like me to remember this product, New Coke. Do you remember 1985? The Coca-Cola company, this was the height of the cola wars, and Coca-Cola decided, well, we are going to do something very bold. We're going to introduce a brand new recipe for Coca-Cola, and they trotted out Bill Cosby and all kinds of celebrities, and to great fanfare, they released New Coke onto the market. Well, you remember what happened. Consumers turned thumbs down on New Coke so ferociously, you think this is the end of civilization. You know, the people were furious. Probably people were crying, I don't know. But this was a consumer failure, a flop of just biblical proportions. But that's not the end of the story. Within 70 days, the Coca-Cola company, they pulled out a marketing stroke of genius, and that was to reintroduce New Coke, along with Diet Coke, which was their other brand, which was sort of coming into the foray a little bit more. And with this troika now of colas, they did in fact gain market share over Pepsi. Now the jury is still out if this was ever a marketing failure by Coke or not, or if they intended to do this the whole time. Lots of conspiracy theories out there. But I think New Coke itself as a failure, or as a product, was a market failure, but they turned it around into a marketing success. Another canned consumer item, WD-40, that sits under your kitchen sink or maybe in your garage. WD-40 stands for Water Displacement 40th Formula. It took 40 attempts to get just the right formulation and just the right combination of chemicals to, in fact, perfect the product. It was invented by kind of an independent scientist in the 50s. His name was Norm Larson, who was trying to, in fact, invent exactly this. Now, I don't know how the whole story goes, and this is where I'm embellishing and making it all up. But you can imagine poor Norm downstairs in his basement laboratory working away, and his wife calling down saying, "Norm, give it up. You've tried this 39 times. You know, it's time to give it up." But fortunately, Norm didn't stop at the 39th attempt. He tried one more attempt, and in fact, we have the product we do today. The world is full of products, of course, that went through a series of failed iterations, but I worry about our culture, maybe our business culture, particularly in 2014. I don't know if we have enough patience for 40 or for 39 failed attempts at something before Norm would either be fired or that's the end of his contract. I think we need to learn more patience with failed attempts because, in fact, they do often produce something very valuable. Aviation, another great example of failed attempts. Some of the first attempts at flight around 1909. I don't know how many failed attempts at aviation there ever were. I don't know how many people were maimed or killed or hurt very badly. I would not get in that thing at all. And I can't help but wonder if aviation was just getting off the ground today, pardon the pun, but if aviation was in its early stages in 2014, my guess is the government would shut this down right now. Someone is going to get hurt, and this is banned, Now, I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting we do dangerous things that are going to hurt us or kill us, but I think that spirit of risk-taking, trying to push things to see where things can go, even though there might be some spectacular failures along the way, I think we need to recapture that a little bit. Something from my home province, 1947, the Leduc No. 1 gusher. This comes after, not many people know this story, but the Leduc No. 1 comes after decades of dry holes where they were trying to find oil in Alberta. They had found natural gas in the southern part of the province, but they hadn't really found oil in a big way. And again, I wasn't around in 1947. I was around for New Coke, but I wasn't around for the Leduc No. 1. I don't know if at the time the attitude was, give it up. You're never going to find oil in this province. There could have been some of that sentiment. Fortunately, though, enough people did not give up. And in looking in just the right places and with the right techniques and technology, they did, in fact, find oil. And that changed the course of Canada's economy forever. All right. A final theme I want to talk about, and then I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Collaboration. Gregory Burns, again, the neuroscientist. A person can have the greatest idea in the world, but if that person can't convince enough other people, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. An idea in isolation very rarely is going to go anywhere. Where ideas really flourish, it's exactly in settings what you folks are doing here in the last 2 days. Coming together in community, in collaboration, rubbing ideas together, and that's where you get flourishing of ideas. Probably a lot of you experienced this yesterday, and some of the exercises we were doing yesterday, and we'll probably be doing later this afternoon, I'm guessing, is taking an idea and throwing it out there and someone else adding to that idea. And then someone else getting sort of excited or maybe an idea twigs in their mind. And yeah, what we can do is add to that this. And these ideas just take off. Now, when you look back over the last 1,000 years or so of human civilization, we see these level shifts in science and mathematics and astronomy. They didn't happen accidentally. They happened often for a very good reason. When you think about the Italian Renaissance around the late 1400s, early 1500s, it all happened in that place in Europe, in kind of northern central Italy, for a reason. The feudal system at the time was kind of falling apart, and for the first time, people were moving to larger cities. They were moving to cities like Florence and Milan and Rome. And all of a sudden, the scientists and the academics who were living in more or less complete isolation, like there was no Twitter in 1492, all of a sudden, they found themselves as next-door neighbors. They were suddenly in community with each other. And the idea was, well, what are you working on in your laboratory? And here's what I'm working on in mine. And they realized by combining these ideas and rubbing them together, what arrives out of that is far greater than the sum of the two of them in isolation. The same kind of thing with the Enlightenment period in London and in France and in Paris. It was all around these academics, the great thinkers and writers and philosophers. And they were coming together in these coffee houses, which my guess is they were more just beer halls than really coffee houses. But in any sense, this is where it was all happening, in this coffee house culture in Paris, where these academics would come together and they would argue and they would debate and they'd be in community and they would exchange ideas. And all of a sudden, at the time, there was a level shift in human reason. It was called the Enlightenment. Philosophy and writing and every kind of stage of that reason really flourished at that time because people found themselves in community and they were collaborating. All right, where I want to shift gears for the time I've got remaining, I want to talk about these three terms specifically: invention, innovation, and design. And I'm going to show you some of my definitions about this. Now, there are lots of definitions for these words, and I'm approaching it again from an economics perspective. So I don't want anyone to get too fussed if, oh, well, the definition of innovation I read in a different book was something different, and what is the definition? There are lots of definitions for these words, and I actually think that's helpful. I think the more definitions and the more different perspectives you can have on a word, it gives the word and the term really more richness. So my definitions might look a little bit different than other people's definitions, but this is sort of, again, the way I'm approaching it as an economist and how these things add value to our economy. The first, invention, pretty simple definition. It's a process of creating something brand new, something unlike anything seen before. Now, of the three, invention is the rarest. It really doesn't come along very often at all. And in fact, I hate to use a lot of cliches, but these would be those game changers, something that comes along, some new kind of invention or some sort of device. I'll give some examples. That all of a sudden, everything's changed, almost instantly. Innovation, on the other hand, that is the application of an existing technology or technologies to a new and very useful purpose. This is where we're taking things that already pre-exist. We're not really inventing anything new. What we're doing is we're taking existing things and making a new connection with them, applying them in a way no one had really thought of doing that before, or maybe combining them in a really interesting way, that suddenly this is really useful. Again, I'll show you some examples. Finally, the ugly stepsister, design. I think this is the one that is ignored the most, but again, from an economic perspective, probably has the most, is doing all the heavy lifting in terms of adding value to our economy. That's the improvement of an existing technology to create something more practical, something more useful, or something more aesthetically pleasing. Think back to the toilet brush. And again, I don't want to, the toilet brush is maybe a trivial example, but there are all kinds of examples where a real wealth creation has derived from fantastic design. And again, I don't think this is going to be new to a lot of you folks, because I know a lot of you spend a lot of your time researching these things. Here are some examples. Electricity. Now, humans didn't invent electricity, of course, but we did invent, at a certain point, ways to kind of harness electricity. Again, borrowing from Ken Robinson, he tells a story of, at the University of London, Michael Faraday, this physicist, I guess, who was conducting these incredible experiments with electricity. And he was conducting these experiments in the science theater to all the faculty, and they were just these wild things with electricity. And the faculty, they were all stunned by this. And they said, well, Dr. Faraday, this is all very interesting, but what is any of this good for? They could not see what's the application here. It's not like, again, Ken Robinson's joke, it's not like every house in London had a refrigerator just waiting to be plugged in. If someone could hurry up and invent electricity, we could plug this in and that would be useful. Invention, pure invention, often comes far before anyone can really think, what is this practical for? Of course, we know now the practical applications of electricity, but when Faraday first invented ways to harness and channel electricity, that was an invention that was, in fact, waiting for some applications. Then you get to a gramophone, another pure invention, I would argue, Thomas Edison, who developed this. Now, I don't know the story of the gramophone when he first perfected his little tin cylinders, and was able to capture a sound and play it back. I don't know if, at some point there must have been a second person to come and hear this, right? Thomas Edison being the first. At some point he must have called someone into his little workshop and said, hey, come in and check this out. I want to show you something. And play this thing back. The reaction for that second person should have been, what kind of devil machine is this? Because this is something brand new. For none of us in this room is recorded sound a concept any of us are unfamiliar with, but for the first person to hear, other than Edison, to hear a sound played back, this is unlike anything seen or, in this case, heard before. And that was, of course, a real game changer, a pure invention. Another invention, the vacuum tubes, leading to what I would call an innovation, the computer, the first prototypes of computers. Here's now where we're taking vacuum tubes and electricity and combining them in a way that gives us something really useful. I would argue in that sense that computer is not an invention, but rather an example of an innovation, taking things that existed already, technologies, and making a connection to give us something super useful. Then you get to another game-changing invention, the microchip, or the microprocessor. This again changes everything for the world of computer use, for data storage, makes all kinds of things possible that weren't possible before that microchip. Then another, I would call this an innovation, the MP3 player of the 80s and 90s. Now this takes two existing things, the microchip and also recorded information, and I guess maybe electricity, combining them into something that is really useful, a portable device that you can carry around with you that plays music or whatever you want it to play. A really useful innovation. But have a look at that. This, I would argue, is fantastic design application. Apple did not invent the they didn't invent the microchip. They didn't innovate the MP3 player. What they took was a really clunky, kind of awkward MP3 player and applied fantastic design to it. Not many people had those MP3 players. As commercial products, they didn't even really take off. But now Apple has cleaned up on the whole MP3 market. Most people, or kids anywhere, probably all of you, have something like that, and it's because of the fantastic design. They put bright colors on it, they made it really, really simple and useful to use, made it kind of a sexy, desirable product. Everyone wants one of those, whereas that MP3 player above, not really a big hit. Some other examples, the wheel. We don't really know who first invented the wheel. Maybe Fred Flintstone, I guess, we don't know exactly, but at some point, someone must have thought, hey, this is actually kind of useful. If you lift this rock and carve it a certain way, you can stick a hole through it, and we've got something that we can actually do something with. Then you get to something like the first horse-drawn carriage. I would argue this is an innovation. Now we're taking something that pre-existed, which is the wheel, applying to it something else, which is a horse or some source of power. Now we get to something pretty useful, an innovation. You get to the Model T, which again I would suggest is an innovation, not an invention. And in fact, Henry Ford, he's really credited with not the automobile, but the assembly line. But the Model T did kind of change everything. But when you look at that horse-drawn carriage and the Model T, there's not really very much difference. The only difference with the automobile, with the Model T, is now we're taking something that pre-exists, a technology, the horse-drawn carriage, and we're applying to it another technology, the combustion engine, putting those things together, and now you've got something really useful, an innovation. And then after 100 years, you get to the contemporary automobile. I would say this is 100 years of design improvements, not invention, not really even innovation. There's fundamentally not too much difference between that Model T and the smart car or any contemporary car. You look at them, they both have 4 wheels. You get in it, you steer it, you roll forward in it. Something powers it, if it's gasoline or maybe now electricity. But fundamentally, it's really 100 years of design improvements, not invention, not innovation. And this is where I think design, as a source, I guess, of creating wealth, is often overlooked. So many companies, they want to be innovative. In fact, I was giving a talk similar to this to a bunch of transportation. It was a transportation forum or seminar. And some hands shut up at the end, and they said, yeah, we understand what you're saying about innovation and design, but our company is being truly innovative. Everyone wants to hold on to that word. And they started telling me what, in fact, their railway company was doing. And I didn't respond in this way because I'm not a jackass, but I said, actually, you're not doing innovation at all. You're doing fantastic design application. You think of the railways, they haven't really changed much in 200 years. Like some big locomotive pulls a bunch of wagons onto rail. Like, it hasn't really changed, but it's not to say it hasn't advanced. Design improvements have been tremendous. And that's where there's a lot of wealth to be created. But everyone wants to hold on to that word innovation. It's an important word. I think sometimes it's an overused word, and you guys might have some thoughts on that. Innovation, and now we're going to be spending a lot of time this afternoon and this morning talking about innovation. But I think innovation is a little less common than design. But innovation is very important, making those connections in new ways, and we'll talk about that in education. Last example I want to talk about, early Bronze Age or Iron Age, when humans first started to perfect weapons and spears and little things to jab or stab things with. And then you get to the medieval ages, and you get to better techniques and perfections in how to hone iron and metal, and you get to swords and things like that. Here's an innovation, taking some of those applications on how to work with metal and to get to the razor blade. Here now is something very, very useful. Something a consumer could buy, afford to take this home with them. This kind of changes everything for the world of barber shops and innovation, but I would say something like that is design improvement. The Gillette Mach 3. Here, we're not inventing the razor blade. We're not really even innovating. We're taking kind of a dangerous little object, applying some great design to it, and making it something that is not only safer, but a much more useful and a much more effective product. So those are my definitions. I'll close with this. The Wampons de Lyon, he searched for the fountain of youth. We say we've got enough youth. What we need is a fountain of smart. What we need is a population. Actually, we need more youth too, but it really doesn't matter at which age or which stage of life we're in. If we're young or middle-aged or mature Canadians, we all need to be smart. And when I talk about smart, I really am talking about we need to be more creative in our thinking. We need to apply design, innovation, and if possible, invention in everything that we're doing, bringing great design ideas to our everyday tasks. So with that, I will wrap up. Just some of my contact information if you're interested in connecting with me. Darren, do we have time for, is it 10 o'clock now? Am I running over time, or? You're okay. We're okay? Do we have time for questions, or do we want to maybe do that later or move into the next session?
So I'm looking at Carolina, who's actually running the show.
And she's saying, shut him up. Okay.
No, but but I'm going to use privilege here and say we have time for a question or two. So anybody? There's somebody at the back. Do we have mics, or just speak really loud?
Good morning. Two things. At what point does design become stylization? Because I would, just to throw this out there, I'd argue that maybe cars are stylized, yet the iPod was a great design. And secondly, with regards to failures, yeah, failures are great because it's a learning experience, and I encourage my students to learn from them. It's a safe environment. Do it here. But try not to do it out there. Because I can tell you, building failure is not a funny thing. And we do have an industry where we do and are expected to get it right. So again, that fine balance, at what point do we have to encourage getting it right, getting the right, there is a right answer to design, believe it or not. We have to work hard to get there, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great points. And I don't want to trivialize this because, yeah, when you talk about bridges or buildings, you can't have this fail. But if you're an engineering student, there are processes before you are actually allowed to build a building where you do learn how to fail. This is maybe part of the education system. So before we let you construct this tower, you are going to go through some processes, but you have to be allowed in those processes to fail. And the question or the comment too about style rather than design, that's a good one too. It sort of harkens this conversation I had with, what was it, a bubblegum manufacturer, and they were coming up with all these new flavors. And I wasn't suggesting to them, but in a different sort of context, I was suggesting what they're doing, certainly it's not innovative. It's not even really design. They're not designing a new bubblegum. Different flavors of bubblegum, you might call that style. They're trying sort of desperately to kind of capture a little bit more of the market. But style, I mean, there's probably some space for that too, but I would say there's not as much wealth creation that comes out of just changing the style of something rather than fundamentally changing the design of the product. But it's a good point.
Great question. Any other? Ralph?
Thanks for the talk. Great talk. Just wondering what the role of there's a lot of talk about entrepreneurs. I'm just wondering what the role of the entrepreneur is in, where do you situate the entrepreneur so that they can actually thrive in a creative space inside medium to large organizations?
Yeah, that's a great point too. And it is something that we do talk about in our book. When we talk about entrepreneurial spirit, we don't restrict that to people who are striking out on their own and starting their own business, even though those folks are really important too. But the entrepreneur, I like this term that's come up now. This is where we require some buy-in from management and buy-in actually from the rest of the team that's working with them. We were talking a little bit yesterday. I think again it was Gerard who was talking about someone puts up their hand, they've got a new idea, and the first thing we do as a team is we play whack-a-mole with it, don't we? We tried that. That's a bad idea, And after so many hits of the whack-a-mole, people become really reluctant to put their hand up and say, I've got an idea, even if it is kind of a half-baked idea. All ideas at some point were half-baked, right? Every loaf of bread at some point was precisely half-baked. But there are, we do need, as team members, as managers, as I guess senior people in companies, we do need to have more patience with these ideas, not to reward every idea and saying that's a fantastic idea, but rather to say there's something in that idea, it's half-baked at this point, but keep working on that and talk around with your peers and see if we can make that idea into something, rather than playing the whack-a-mole, which is our reaction, I think, too often.
Thank you. One last question before we go to a break. So, Ian McNabb, keeping in mind you're keeping people from coffee, so no pressure.
Okay, and I apologize for this because it's not a question. But you kind of left Michael Faraday hanging out there in front of an audience, and he'd been asked a question. And I'm sure you know what the answer was, but I thought I'd mention it anyway to show how far-sighted some people are. His answer was, I do not know of what use electricity is, but I guarantee you that within 30 years, Her Majesty's government will tax it.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, because I did not know the rest of the story.
And thank you for your engaging talk, Todd. I'll invite Carolina up here. We have a tradition at Sheridan. We talk about being the creative campus and our creativity. And we like to thank people who do a great job like yourself by providing them with an example of Sheridan creativity.
Oh man,
so
that's beautiful.
Made from our glass shop. Thank you very much,
That is fantastic.
Todd.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
So I'm also really excited to announce, about a year and a half ago, I met Todd through a contact of mine, a wonderful lady who unfortunately couldn't be here today, who runs a company that looks at space as a means of increasing creativity. Her company is called ThinkSpot. When we partnered up together with a project where we looked at creativity in the literature, and as part of that project, we were able to secure some of Todd's wonderful book on the boiling frog, which we will now make available to participants of this conference. All we ask is, it's on a first come, first serve, and we're asking for a donation to the Sheridan Student Food Bank. So they will be outside if you would like a copy of the book, and I highly recommend it. It's a great read, it's an easy read. If I could read it, anybody else can. It's a wonderful book, and we hope that you will secure a copy up front. So I now encourage people to take about a 10-15-minute break. Please go visit the displays of our students and the students who have brought their displays to show the kind of innovation and creativity, and we'll meet back at about 10:20. Thank you.